What horrific act did some of the men of Gibeah commit, and what did the Levite do in response? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Judges on Walking Through the Bible. Before beginning, I feel it is my duty as a preacher of the gospel to issue a warning to parents who might be listening with young children that this lesson deals with the issue of a brutal sexual assault and murder, and therefore I ask you to consider the maturity of your children before continuing. What we're going to be discussing is not a topic, uncomfortable as it may be, that those who are mature should skip in our walk through the Bible, for we can learn some valuable lessons about sin from it, and it is necessary to examine in order to fully understand chapters 20 and 21 of Judges. Let it be known, though, that in the discussion of this topic, we will not be crude or graphic, but will approach it delicately and appropriately, as we do with any sensitive topic that the Bible talks about. So, today we're going to be discussing Judges 19, verses 22 to 30. But before we do, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Judges 19, verse 22. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Judges 19, beginning at verse 22. As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally." But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please. But to this man do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not heed him. So the man took his concubine and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. When her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, there was his concubine fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up and let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. When he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, "No such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up." In our last two lessons, we've been following the Levite from Ephraim and his concubine. It appears from the text that this man's concubine had abandoned him and returned to her father's house. The reason for this abandonment was not stated, although later on in this lesson, a possible reason for why the woman left might be able to be drawn. After 4 months, the Levite decided to go and reconcile with his wife, which occurred, after which they all began traveling back home. On the first night, they stopped in Gibeah of Benjamin. Nobody in the town would be hospitable to them by taking them in, except an old man, who too was an Ephraimite. This lack of hospitality by the people of Gibeah was a direct violation of the law of Moses, but that is of course not the only violation that some in this town would commit that evening. That the town leaders, though, tolerated this type of behavior shows us the moral decline of Israel after the days of Joshua. Picking up now at verse 22, we find that there were perverted men in the city, and by this the Bible means those who practiced homosexuality, who came to the old man's door and wanted to have sex with the Levite who had come into this man's house. Homosexuality was condemned under the law of Moses, for Leviticus 18 verse 22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." Our society today likes to downplay this verse, trying to get it not to say what it clearly says. Now, the law of Moses isn't our law today, but when we get to our study of Romans and 1 Corinthians, we're going to see such practices are equally condemned in the New Testament. As Christians, though, we are not to hate people who practice such sins, nor are we to hurt or physically treat people who practice such sins poorly in any way. We are, though, in love to try to teach them that they're in sin and in need of repentance, just as an adulterer or fornicator is in sin and need of repentance. To not do so would be an act of hate, for nobody who is living in sin is going to be in heaven, no matter how much we might wish it to be so. Coming back to Judges 19 now. The old man says that they should not do such a vile thing and violate the man who was his guest, instead offering up to these men his virgin daughter and the man's concubine to do with them as they pleased. Now to us, we might wonder what's going on here, but the custom in this time period and in this part of the world was to protect your guest at all cost. The guest was the Levite man. What about the man's concubine? Concubines were not treated the same as full wives were, and so she was not considered to be a guest in the same sense the Levite man was. Now it is not often that I comment on the customary practices of the people in other cultures, noting that we shouldn't view our culture as holier than another culture simply because our practices have changed. But in this instance, I must make an exception, not because our culture is better, but because this cultural practice was sinful. No, not the part about being hospitable or protecting those under your roof, but the practice of offering someone to commit what they might consider a lesser sin in order to spare the life of your guest. The women in this story were utterly abused by the men that were supposed to protect them. Now yes, fear might have washed over these two men, for chapter 20 said that these men were threatened with death. But what part about loving your neighbor would condone someone saving their own life by offering up someone else to be abused or raped? And the answer to that is none. Simply because the Bible includes a story like this does not mean that God condones any of the actions contained in those stories. He simply shows man just as he is, sinful and in need of the salvation offered by him. But because of the cowardice of these two men, and because the situation appeared to be getting worse, the Levite's concubine was handed over to these men of the city, who brutally raped her for the entire evening. What absolutely vile, sinful behavior, and behavior that we as Christians should not condone or try to justify. By allowing his concubine to be treated this way, this shows us that the Levite didn't love his concubine as he should have, which might shed some light as to why she fled from him in the first place. When the night was over, the woman had found her way back to the old man's house, but her condition was so bad that she died on the doorstep. I find it especially troubling that the Levite had been able to sleep through the whole night, and that he was particularly cold to her plight the next morning when he saw her, wishing to simply be on his way, as if nothing had happened. No seeking to attend to her injuries, no guilt or remorse for having given her over to be raped in the first place. No, nothing. That is not how we should be treating those whom we love, or even those who we consider our enemies. We need to comfort and support those we love in times of trouble, and protect them from trouble whenever we get the chance. When the Levite saw that his concubine was dead, though, he did act. I don't know whether this action was spurred on by anger or guilt, or a bit of both, but the Levite did act in wanting what happened to his concubine punished. In order to get people's attention, though, he cut up his wife into 12 pieces and sent these pieces, one piece to each tribe in Israel, telling them what had happened to her was like nothing that had happened before in Israel since coming up from Egypt, and they needed to assemble and act in order to put this evil out from among their presence. To say that nothing like this had happened in Israel since they left Egypt gives us a painful commentary on the consequences of allowing some of the Canaanites in the land to remain. Why did God want Israel to kill all the Canaanites back in the days of Joshua? Because they had gone off into debauchery and sin. In allowing them to remain, Israel allowed herself to be influenced by such sinful behavior, and such influence didn't take centuries to rub off, but rather only a few years. If only Israel had listened to God and done what he said, then perhaps this type of evil wouldn't have been among them. What would the reaction be of the 12 tribes of Israel? We'll find out, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. We will be taking our 2-week spring break, and will return, the Lord willing, on Monday, June 27th, 2022. When we will return, we will take up with Judges 20, verses 1 to 11. We hope that you'll come back and join us for that discussion when we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.